Now, we've got what I think is a very important and really key session that goes right down to the central mission of the Kitalys Institute and the conference, and that is to understand how we can get the substantial evidence that is needed, not just for regulatory approval, but to encourage physicians to prescribe if it has to be a regulated product, and for people to use a product. You really need evidence of safety and effectiveness, and that is often lacking, particularly in this field of longevity, where products can be put on the market with very thin evidence. So today we're going to be focusing on regulatory pathways for products that are related to healthy longevity. And I have my, I won't say old friend, but friend of many decades. We both go back to early FDA days where we worked together. He in the general counsel's office, and I in one of the review divisions. And we worked together then, and we continue to work closely. And it's been just a wonderful relationship. David Fox has been thinking deeply about how we could respond to the yearning for creativity in regulatory thinking that would allow products to get to market sooner. And so, David, I'm going to turn it over to you. We have a number of other distinguished people on the panel. We won't introduce them one by one. Remember, you can look in the program and find bios of everybody, but we're so pleased to have a distinguished panel to respond to David's lead. So, David, over to you.
Well, thank you, Zan. Just the audio check, make sure, Zan, you can hear me okay?
Sound good.
Great. Well, thank you, Zan. I just want to start with your reference from this morning to Lewis and Clark and carry that reference over. And I think in that scenario, I would be the guy at the back portaging the last supply of maybe one false move away from being eaten by a grizzly. But I really do appreciate your valiant leadership, and Thomas, and for bringing me into this. I also want to acknowledge that the spectacular presentations from this morning, and for reminding me that I probably should have, but probably couldn't have paid more attention in 10th grade AP Bio. That was really beyond my limits. But I want to say that this particular panel is going to be word heavy. So no diagrams, no picture of cell biology. But what we're trying to do is take the spectacular dynamic science that's at the heart of geroscience, the sort of curvy 3D world that our scientists are seeing, and to borrow an oft-used term, translate that into sometimes flat two-dimensional words on a page, and even potentially statute and regulation and guidance. So how do we bridge that enormous gap between what I think of as the three-dimensional world of science into the two-dimensional world of words on a page? So, Zan, you came to me, I think maybe 5 years ago, with a modest request. Could I help you put the finishing touches on the Orphan Drug Act for health span products? We all know the history of the Orphan Drug Act and what a profound piece of legislation that was, and how it just really revolutionized the development for development of products for patients for whom the industry had all but orphaned. And so I think you even had an image a graphic of it, if I remember, and you just thought maybe I could, sit down for a short while and round it out. It's the Orphan Drug Act itself is only about less than 100 lines of statutory text. It's less than 2 pages in a book. Simple code. And so could we just simply do the same thing for health span products? And here we are 5 years later, and while I always like to say I think we're closer than we've ever been to a finished product, it sometimes feels like the more we look at it, the more questions we have rather than answers. And so my audacious goal for this panel, and hopefully I'll do less of the talking and more of the listening, is to get ideas from this incredibly potent panel about how we would make the critical decisions that would go into a design of a health span regulatory framework. And also, I think we will spend some time just evaluating whether we need a new framework, or can we, integrate the science of health span products into the existing regulatory system. Clearly, that would be preferable, but is that ultimately going to be building a bridge to nowhere, or a bridge to enormous frustration? And in this area, it's not hard to experience decade-long or more setbacks. So we don't want to make a misstep here. We have to understand what we're facing and decide relatively soon, do we need to blaze our own Lewis and Clark pathway, our own Northwest Passage? So with that, just a bit of introduction. I think everyone has the conference materials. That's the fantastic credentials of everyone who's on this panel. So let me offer just a little bit of color to why we have who we have here. So Zan and Thomas, goes without saying. Tom DiLenge and I, have now I spent maybe the last year having this conversation. You've been my muse. I think you have one of the liveliest thought processes about this, and part of Flagship, which is really, they put their muscle behind preemptive medicine and the concept of health span, stage 0 diagnosis. So, I think you're completely immersed in the development side of this, and we're grateful to have you. Dr. Unger, I think, you represent the inside the FDA thought process. You have laid hands, probably, as many as anybody in modern times, on more applications and more difficult applications in the therapeutic space than anyone. So we're grateful that you have offered to do this. Stephen Austad, AFAR has been just a wonderful supporter of this initiative. They've supported the drafting effort, and it's really, we're really trying to translate the science that AFAR itself has been a leader in supporting and backing into, we hope, tangible products. And I think probably, AFAR and people associated with AFAR have had more direct conversations with FDA about how to translate the science into development programs and products than anybody else. Martin Hahn is my probably oldest and closest friend at Hogan Lovells, and is, in my opinion, just peerless in the world of food regulation. And in many ways, I think, some of the concepts that have been used in the food world to allow for the types of claims that we aspire to, although in a more general way, are really the inspiration for how we might design a health span regulatory system. And I think, with Martin's experience, I think it's going to just, it'll take us, I think, those of us who are just steeped in the therapeutic space, I think you'll open our minds to other ways of thinking about this problem. So with that, and I apologize if I've missed anybody. Raise your hand or speak up if I have.
We're
good to go. So let me make an effort at sharing my screen, see if this works. Do we have a problem?
No,
Is everyone seeing it?
no,
Okay.
we're good. We're good here in Houston.
All right, awesome. Okay, so we've heard so much about whether the regulatory system is clear or unclear about how it would address health span products. There's been an epic debate over whether the real approach here should be to change the law to have aging recognized as a disease. I spoke about that last year. I said I would never speak about it again, and so I'll hold to that. For all the reasons I said last year, I just think that's a death spiral, a regulatory death spiral. So we've got to face up to the regulatory architecture, and to me, just to make sure everybody has a common foundation for this discussion, what I think about is the concept of regulatory science. And what I mean by that is science bounded by rules of law informed by public policy. So if this were an exercise in pure science, my simpleton understanding is you would experiment until you achieve truth, or as close to truth as you could possibly get. And you'd keep running the experiment. And in regulatory science, we acknowledge, for public policy reasons, that we can't experiment to the end of time, that we need to make decisions sooner for the public good. And so injected into this whole world of regulatory science are concepts of standards of evidence based on statutes about the types of products that can be marketed and the claims that can be made. And most importantly, an understanding or a discussion about uncertainty. How much uncertainty are we willing to accept in the evidence in order to allow the products to be available sooner rather than long after we believe we know the truth? So in the FDA space, in the regulatory space, this is really, to me, it's always the key concept, where public policy gives you permission as a regulator and as a developer to accept a certain amount of uncertainty in return for a greater good. And how do we apply that concept to what we think of as health span products? So in thinking about how we would legislate this or design a health span pathway, we've set down our design principles. So we want a predictable and coherent pathway. I mean, that predictability is really an essential element of creating a vibrant development market and ultimately a commercial market. We need this system to be evidence-based. That I think that's foundational to the conference, to the Kitalys Institute that supports the conference, and really everything we do. Is we don't want to make a mistake. I think it was a mistake, and I'll just state my own opinion about this. When we passed, Congress passed DeShay in 1994, and in my mind, really disincentivized the development of evidence and evidence-based thinking around dietary supplements. And that's not the pathway that we want. We want this to be evidence-based. Well, we want that evidence to be calibrated to the particular risks and benefits of the products. And that raises a question that we've been struggling with. Do we need a universal system for health span products, or do we need a system that breaks health span products out into different categories, which I'll get to in a moment? And then we always have to keep our eye on protecting consumers and patients from unsafe products and pointless products that have no real effect and carry with them only either risk or economic drain. And then we need a system that incentivizes experimentation, creativity, and investment. And so we could have the best system in the world, but if nobody's willing to use it because it's impractical, because it holds no opportunities at the end. Then we're just spinning our wheels. So what follows is a gross oversimplification. I apologize to the people who are watching this, for whom this is their life's work. But for the sake of expediency, I just want to kind of, again, get our feet on the ground with the three main categories of products that touch on health span. So we have foods, and we have the concept, very interested in the concept of health span foods, which are products that are ingested for taste, aroma, or nutritive value. The drugs and biologics, which are recognized as articles to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or importantly, prevent disease. And we can quibble about this, and there's case law about this, and so on, but generally drugs rely on chemical or metabolic activity to achieve their intended effect. Devices, in contrast, are used both to treat diseases and other conditions, and they rely principally on physical rather than chemical or metabolic action. That's the essential dividing line. And then you may say, well, articles or products can qualify as drugs or devices, even if they're intended only to affect the structure or any function of the body. That's correct. That makes them a drug or device. But to actually gain marketing approval, they generally need to show a clinically meaningful effect on an endpoint. And for a drug or biologic, that would be a disease. For a device, also a disease or another condition associated with a disease. So what are the sort of realms of evidence that have worked their way into the system by law, by statute, that governs the types of products you can market in this area, and importantly, the claims that you can make? So for foods, and not just foods that the everyday foods, but foods that carry a health claim, an authorized health claim, agreed upon by FDA, codified in regulation. The standard is significant scientific agreement. So we get claims such as diets rich in fruits and vegetables and whole grains reduce the risk of cancer. And importantly, these claims they're based on a substance. They're not proprietary claims. No individual company or entity owns this claim. This is for the public good once it's recognized by FDA. For drugs and biologics, of course, we could spend days on this, but essentially it's a substantial evidence standard. It's 2 adequate and well-controlled clinical trials, or famously, as we read about all the time, it's 1 trial plus confirmatory evidence. But it's an experiment. It's a well-controlled experiment that demonstrates a drug effect, separation from drug from placebo, or no significant difference, non-inferiority against a gold standard drug. And then from there, it's a risk-benefit weighing, always a risk-benefit. Are the benefits enough to offset the demonstrable risks of the product? And then the drug system itself, again, much talked about in the press, and what we see from the high-profile approvals that FDA works through. There's a lot of flexibility in the system and a lot of recognition that we have to accept uncertainty, particularly where we have unmet medical need for serious and life-threatening diseases. So the worse, the more dire the condition, the fewer options that we have to offer for patients, the more we're willing to accept a certain degree of uncertainty in the evidence in order to allow the products to be made available sooner rather than later. There's also a concept of not new drugs. These are generally over-the-counter medicines that are regulated under monographs. They don't go through a specific approval. And for these types of drugs, and they are drugs, they do treat, cure, prevent, mitigate disease. It's a general recognition of safety and effectiveness standard. General recognition among experts in the field based on public information. And there's a very extensive FDA process for reaching this decision. So you see a little bit of convergence, between a high-end health claim standard for foods and a basic claim standard for the types of drugs that are available without restriction to consumers, over-the-counter drugs. And then for devices, it's again, would take days to talk about this, but it's essentially a risk-based calibration system where the products are triaged or grouped into different classifications. And then the standard of evidence varies with that classification. In some cases, no evidence is needed. The products can simply self-declare and go on the market. The most high risk and invasive products are those that do require pre-marketing approval under a PMA. And for that, it's a reasonable assurance of effectiveness standard, along with a risk-benefit weighing with respect to safety. And people have gone round and round about whether the reasonable assurance standard for devices, for PMA devices, is congruent with the drug standard of substantial evidence of effectiveness. Depends on who you ask, but the important point is not so much in this instance the words on the page, but the culture of the two sets of regulators. So typically for a device, the regulators want to see a functional effect. For example, do I see a better, cleaner picture or image if I'm looking at an imaging agent? Whereas the drug regulator will ask, well, did that intervention allow me to make a different diagnosis? Did it change the clinician's decision making? So we don't just give, at the drug side, I think the culture is we don't just give things to people for the sake of giving it to them, just because we might see an effect. That effect has to be clinically meaningful. It has to make a difference. Otherwise, it's not worth the cost in terms of risk of the drug. Devices, I think, takes a little bit of a different approach. So health span products, we could debate what we mean by that, but just starting with a basic definition: products intended to reduce the risk or delay the onset or defer the onset of age-related disability or the occurrence of multiple chronic age-related conditions. And I think that's one of the standout differentiators when we talk about health span products from the types of products that FDA tends to approve as therapeutics. And that's, health span products tend to be, the way we're thinking about them is they are so far upstream in the unfolding of the disease state that they address or involve multiple systems that could lead to multiple diseases. While when we look at the types of products that FDA typically approves, they're almost always one-to-one disease-specific products. So again, to round this out, what type of evidentiary standards, if we had a clean slate here, would we want to govern health span products? How much uncertainty should we be willing to accept? What type of incentives are going to be needed here, given the nature of the evidence that might have to be developed? And then what's the role of all of the other more nuanced ways of getting to market? Surrogate endpoints, biomarkers, or might we want our own category, indicia of health span or biological aging? So just to give you a sense, a little kind of reference point for how FDA has regulated in the area of preventive medicine, it's really categorically different from what I think we envision for health span products. It's very disease specific. It's very much targeted to patients who are on the cusp of the disease or clearly are showing risk factors for the disease. It's singular disease specific. Generally, requiring a clear showing of an immediate clinical benefit in order to justify the risks. And then, we have certain targets. We've talked about these at other conferences: sarcopenia, for loss of skeletal muscle mass associated with aging, NASH, where sponsors have been pressing FDA for product approvals. I think NASH may be the closest, but still to this day, we do not have approved products in these areas. On the food side, just for comparison, these are the types of claims that we tend to see. Again, very general, very in a way, not to be too pejorative, but sort of mushy claims. They're tied to a substance, not a product, but they do meet this, particularly for the authorized health claims, which FDA has a rigorous system. They do have to meet the standard of significant scientific agreement. So the concept is, do we need some sort of Healthy Resiliency and Healthy Longevity Interventions Act, or a better title, to establish a framework for health span products so we can begin to translate or see how the wonderful science that's being discussed in this conference would ultimately be funneled into products that could see the light of day under the FDA system. Products that are evidence-backed, where that evidence could be communicated, that can make claims that would be interpretable, understandable in the marketplace, and where it could be done, within our lifetimes. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. If I know how to do that. Let's see. Okay, are we back? Okay, back live. And let me start. I want to give Zan the first opportunity to jump in and help clean up everything that I've muffed and set the stage. But you've thought about this longer than anyone. And Zan, not to be forgotten, we never forget. Your role as one, you were in my day, the standout senior reviewer within the most productive review division in CDER in its day. And so you know what it's like to review new products, and you know what it's like to evaluate evidence, and you know the existing system. And of course, your life's work now has been the health span products. And how do you see those two converging or not?
Well, first, David, I can't even respond adequately to that description, but thank you so much. It's a brilliant structure that you have conceived, and I think your definition of health span products or claims is particularly elegant. It's worth emphasizing that this is not just an aspiration based on hope and wanting the fountain of youth, but the neuroscience hypothesis is that these chronic diseases, and even cancer and age-related disability, are driven by shared common drivers. And therefore, if you can touch the right button, you can hope to reduce the risk of these multiple disabilities and chronic diseases. So it's very important to emphasize that this is not based on some kind of wish. It's based on science we have now in hand and substantiated in animal models, and we hope will soon start to be substantiated in humans, that allows us to conceive that there could be this novel category of health span products or indications. And how the drug label or the device label would read is another detail. But you could say that if there were some sort of overarching way of dealing with all of these three entities, foods, drugs, and devices, that would be preferable to having a separate silo for each one of them. I would say that the tie that could bind most of these or all of them together would be they have to share safety, demonstrated safety. So that would be, without question, a major criterion for having some kind of unified approach that would be an umbrella all over all these different entities. So we've got great expertise both on the drug side and the food side, and you can cover devices as well. And then we have the scientific expertise that's represented by Steve Austad.
Well, thank you, Zan. Thank you. Well, let me pick that up and put my friend Martin on the spot first, which is, so if we thought about this as building up from our experience in the food area, I mean, the claims for foods sort of they rhyme with what we have in mind for health span claims. So if we start there, answering Zan's question about safety first. How do we think about safety in the food context? What allows for these types of claims to be made against what sort of safety risk? And I think you're going to tell me, well, foods by definition are safe, but at a more technical level, how do we assess the safety in the food context?
Right. So there is a different standard for foods and dietary supplements, and so you do need to look at them differently. But for food, it's reasonable certainty of no harm, which means they have to be safe. Anything that's added to any conventional ingredient added to a conventional food, safety is first and foremost. And also there's a DiLenge clause, which Congressman DiLenge put in the 1958 Food Additive Amendments, which prohibits FDA from approving any food additive if it causes cancer in man or other animals, even at de minimis levels. And so any food ingredient, it cannot cause cancer in man or other animals. And unlike in the drug or device world where FDA can do a risk-benefit analysis, there's no risk-benefit when it comes to food ingredients. So safety, I think, is first and foremost. Dietary ingredients are a hot mess. I think that's the legal term. Thank you, DeShay, where if you're grandfathered, which means that Congress said if you were on the market on October 15th, 1994, which is when they passed the law, you can continue on the market, and FDA bears the burden of proof of demonstrating that they present a significant unreasonable risk of injury or illness. And so I'm not going to stand here today and say that the dietary supplement world has the same emphasis on safety that the food ingredient world does, because they're very different. But that was through an act of Congress. So if we're talking food ingredients, definitely reasonable certainty of no harm. Those ingredients are tested and proven to be safe. Dietary ingredients are different, and I can't say that they are going to have the same type of evidence-based safety standard that you're going to have for food ingredients.
So reasonable certainty of no harm. So I was, I was indoctrinated at FDA into the idea that there's no free lunch in pharmacology, that no harm, no effect. So Dr. Austad, when we think about the types of effects we're trying to achieve here, do we necessarily have to absorb a certain level of risk beyond the type of risk that Martin Hahn is describing that we accept for foods and dietary supplements?
I think it's likely. I think it's likely that if you're going to affect something as deeply rooted in biology as aging, that there are going to be side effects. On the other hand, what is the acceptability of these side effects depends on the benefit. And so I don't think you can do these things. I'll just tell you from the perspective of a scientist. We had about 7 years ago, a number of scientists were discussing what should be the first drug that we should try to test in humans. And it was a small group in a secluded castle in Spain talking about this. I was in favor of rapamycin being the first drug. But the side effects of rapamycin, particularly giving chronically and not at therapeutic doses, but at anti-aging doses, we didn't know. We ended up shifting to metformin. And metformin we shifted to mainly because there were 60 years of safety evidence for it. So we thought, at least for the first high-profile clinical trial of a senescence retarding product, that safety should be the overwhelming criterion. that we used. I'm not sure if that was the wisest decision or not, but I do think that the first product that really gets FDA approval is going to be enormous. It's going to generate an enormous amount of publicity. If the safety profile isn't pretty concrete, I think that could be very damaging to the field. So I do think we have to be very careful, particularly in the first trial.
So in the early pioneering stages of this endeavor, we're thinking in terms of existing chemical entities, certainly not new chemical entities.
I think for sure, because there is safety information on that, and we don't want to jump from something that is wonderful in mice, but kills 3 out of the first 1,000 people that take it. That would be a marketing catastrophe. So I do think, at least initially, and I think the initial stages are very important because, as you talk about incentivizing the research, I think if we have a successful pathway to approval, even if it's somewhat complex, the possibility of having millions of people taking a product regularly for decades is a pretty good incentive on its own.
Correct. Yeah. But well, let's tease out maybe the first part of the issue, which is, okay, we're going to put some safety burden on those who choose to use it, and so we need offsetting benefit that outweighs that burden, and then which inevitably leads to the question of how are we going to tease out that benefit, and I think the hurdle we always run into is if we take the traditional regulatory framework, apply that here, and think in terms of demonstrating a clinical benefit based on a clinical endpoint. So improvement in survival, in how patients function or feel in a clinically meaningful way. I take it we're talking about decades worth of study. Prove me wrong about that.
Yeah, not necessarily. I don't think. And the way we've been thinking about the TAME trial, particularly, and likely to talk more about this in the next session, is to take people who already had some health problems, but are at high risk of developing additional ones, health problems because of their age or because of previous health problems, and showing a benefit there, which could be done presumably in a fairly short order. Now, that's not where we want to go ultimately. That's the problem. Where we want to go ultimately is giving something to healthy people to keep them healthy. That's a whole different thing, and that's going to rely on acceptable biomarkers. There's just no way around that. Nobody's going to wait 50 years to find out if these products work. So and the good news is I think that those kind of biomarkers are very much on the horizon now, something that I wouldn't have said even 5 years ago.
So just to restate that. So there are ways to enrich the patient population in these studies that we think can significantly, meaningfully compress the amount of time or the number of subjects we would need to see to be able to see a difference between those who got the intervention and those who did not.
Right, exactly. And one of the things when you were showing your slides that caught my attention was the approval for sunscreens, because that seems to me to have certain parallels with what we're after here. And so I didn't know at all about how that was done, but my guess is there might be something to learn from that.
Yeah. It's kind of an old chestnut. At the time, I think we saw them as close to risk-free. I think there's quite a lot of change in the thinking today about that. But okay, so enriched trials is one opportunity, and then the place another place where this conversation inevitably leads is biomarkers. Now, help me understand why, when we think about biomarkers where we would show an effect on the marker sufficient to persuade regulators that the effect is meaningful enough to outweigh the types of risks that you outline, that just doesn't lead us back to a circular proposition in which, in order to qualify or demonstrate the persuasiveness of the biomarker, we would need clinical endpoint type evidence. I mean, how?
Well, see, I think that
yeah, I mean, I think then do we need concepts like, significant scientific agreement among experts to take the place of clinical validation of a biomarker?
I think we could probably rely on strong evidence, which I guess would lead to scientific agreement. Let me tell you where I think we have today that we don't have, that we didn't have a few years ago. We had, first of all, a bunch of molecular techniques that I won't go into, but the main thing that I think we've developed is massive biobanks of biological samples for people that we have a tremendous amount of clinical information about now, and we will have, and we've had it for years. And so there are literally hundreds of thousands of people with stored biological samples for decades whose health histories we know very well. And I think with this, particularly with the assistance of artificial intelligence, that some biomarkers are inevitably going to come out of that. Now, they need to be biomarkers that could be modifiable in a short enough time span. But still, I just think, and those are international efforts now, not just based in the US. So I think one of the things that we would need to get the FDA to agree to is accepting evidence that was generated internationally. And I don't know enough about their procedures to know if that's plausible, probable, or already here.
So we're drowning in reference data, but we need to swim in it.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right.
That's Tom DiLenge. That's where I think, turn it over to you, because I know that that's of keen interest to you, is harnessing that data to find, and I don't want to steal your thunder, but as I understand, find patterns within the data that we wouldn't see without the benefit of AI, and that those patterns can be very, very, they can be validated, very strong predictors. But tell us about what you've been looking at in that area.
Yeah, so thank you first for having me, and thank you for Zan and Thomas for all your work in this area. So I work at Flagship Pioneering, which is a venture creation firm. We actually invest in our own science. We have our own labs, and we're spending a lot of time looking at issues around how you use AI and how you train systems to look at those kind of databases that Stephen was talking about. How do you actually, and we've been aggregating a lot of that data, getting it from a lot of different sources. One problem you have automatically is, do the systems actually, are they compatible? Are people tracking the same types of data points? So there's a lot of noise in the system. And I think one of the challenges, particularly from an FDA perspective, is going to be, how do you account for that noise as you think about these types of algorithms? How precise, how sensitive can they be? But we're spending a lot of time trying to figure that out now, which is, how do we develop these algorithms? How do we train these models to be predictive? And then we test against that to see how right we were, right? Using a lot of in vitro type of work, and even in some animal models. So it's that type of effort, which takes a long time, right? And we're trying to obviously work with targets in mind, trying to think about what types of markers from the literature, from other sources that we would think would be relevant, and then see if we can use AI to kind of get us there much more quickly. But ultimately, the goal for us as we think about regulatory reform, and Dave, you and I have had this conversation. Do you need a whole new system? Do you just need to get the FDA to understand that a lot of these new technologies can help accelerate the process of things that used to take decades in terms of prospective epidemiological studies to get scientific agreement around what biomarker may show a trajectory towards disease, and if you can impact that biomarker, is it mechanistically linked to the progression of disease? Those types of analyses, we think we could shortcut dramatically than what the normal process is, but you have to get regulatory buy-in for that. And if that's under Congress coming in and saying, you need the FDA, you need to start to think about these advances in AI, machine learning, and how that can accelerate patient selection. Stephen, you talked about patient enrichment. We obviously think you can do that through AI and machine learning can help you identify those patients, and also to identify what changes you see in biomarkers and what they will lead to or not lead to, right, in those patient populations, so that you can make those kinds of educated decisions. You're still going to need some level of clinical data. You're still going to need to go through some processes. Although I will tell you, with the advent of ARPA-H now, and we've been having a lot of discussions with people around that new agency. And one of the things I think that everyone's interested in is how do you figure out ways that maybe you could not have to do clinical trials in the future, right? The kind of clinical trials as we know them today. So I think it's really fascinating, but it's going to take engagement with the regulatory agency early on and throughout to try to build their comfort level with this type of data and these types of models. And I don't know if we get there without Congress coming in and giving some direction to the agency to do that.
Well, that leads to about 40 questions I have for Dr. Unger. So I, one way I could interpret the concepts that you're talking about is and boil it down to an oft-used phrase inside of FDA is it's interesting hypothesis generating work, but it needs to be tested forward and tested in the human model sufficient to show a difference on a clinical endpoint. But I guess to Dr. Unger, is that I'm curious to hear how you're hearing this, and also and all the way to the larger question of what Tom has described. Is that more about a cultural change within the agency to accept these types of demonstrations based on in silico analysis, or based on your living under the regulatory standard for your career, is this a true change in the words on the page and the regulations and the statute?
Well, first, I'd like to thank Zan for inviting me to speak on the panel. I have a lot of thoughts. I'm not sure where to start, but I'm going to start with a detail. So if you have some kind of biobank for hundreds of thousands of patients worldwide, and you're going to look at that with artificial intelligence, you're going to find positives, right? You're going to find some things are going to be associated with bad outcomes just by chance. And so what FDA, I think, would tell you, what Bob Temple would tell you is sequester a database, maybe split your database in half, and show that you can, replicate the findings in that you find something in database 1. Now show me that it predicts, it's essentially an experiment. Show me it predicts the same outcome in database 2. Now, obviously, if you have access to the whole database and you have some smart people, you can, depends on how you sequester the database, right? Depends on how you divide it. So this is something you want to talk to FDA about before you actually take a dive into it, I think. I think once you take a dive into it and find something, and you will find stuff, you could have a problem. So you might want to talk to FDA about the approach before you take that dive. I just wanted to mention that. I have a lot of general thoughts. First of all, and I still kind of am thinking like the regulator I was. If a company came in and were talking to me about developing a drug for aging, I would say, and probably did say, more power to you. I'm really in favor of developing drugs for aging. Of course, now it's too late for me because I already aged, but it's okay. There are other people. At any rate, the first question is, are you going to reverse the aging process, or are you just going to prevent it? Of course, no, you don't know what you're going to do. But if you are not overly optimistic, you say, well, we'd be happy if we prevent aging. So now I'm thinking, okay, so now your control group has got to show effects of aging, or you're not going to show a treatment effect, right? So how long does it take a control group to age enough that you can detect a change? And it's probably more than a year. So, people have this paradigm in their head, oh, we should be able to do a study. A year is a long study. We should be able to do that biomarker and get approval. Well, no, not for aging, because the aging process isn't rapid enough. You can enrich the population, find people who seem to be on the, on the rapid decline, but there's only some degree to which you can do that. So the point is, it's going to take time to do one of these studies. It's not some quick thing. And and in terms of risk, and it does have to be safe, because you're going to want to give this to millions of people. So anytime you want to give a drug to millions of people who are essentially, they were doing okay. I mean, yeah, they were aging, but it was acceptable to age in 2022. So, you have to be very careful, to first do no harm. But as someone said, if you can show something fairly striking, you prevent intellectual decline, or you prevent, muscle loss or whatever, and you can show that in the course of 2 or 3 years, then some risk is reasonable, I think, to accept. I don't think this is very different from antihypertensive drugs, except that you have an obvious marker that's tried and true. But you give antihypertensive drugs to people in their 30s and 40s, for decades and decades, in order to prevent a stroke that could be, way out there. And they have to be fairly safe, and they are. So they're given to millions of people for preventive treatment. They are pretty darn safe, but not totally safe, but they're pretty safe, right? I don't think it's that different, personally. And I want to stop here because I don't want to hog the microphone too much. But my own view is that the regulatory machinery that's in place now is actually fine for this. I would think accelerated approval is what you'd want to do here, because whether it's a surrogate endpoint that people can agree is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, or you take an intermediate clinical endpoint, which means, well, we'll take preservation of muscle strength over 2 or 3 years, but we want to see what happens over 10 years. So it's an accelerated approval. The background has something about conditional approval. There's no such thing in the US in the regulatory tool bag. So I think take that off the table. But I'll stop. I have a lot of thoughts, but I don't want to hog the mic. So thank you.
No, you could take the floor for the whole time. I think we'd be better for it, actually. So thank you, Dr. Unger. Yeah, I think two things just to pick up from your comments. One, and I'd like to get others to comment on this, is I think we've heard this notion, of the acceptance by the agency of certain surrogates or biomarkers like LDL cholesterol or blood pressure, and saying, well, that if those are our beacons, and we just have to be like that. I think the fear is that that's just too high a mountain to climb, given the decades that it took, and even there's been a lot of rethinking around managing patients to certain metrics, like triglycerides has undergone a lot of conversation. And so the one issue is whether that sounds attainable in a conference room in conversation, but in reality, that if we have to prove our biomarkers to those levels, we'll never get there. So I'll pause. Go ahead, Dr. Unger.
Well, I was just going to say, it didn't take decades to get lipid-lowering drugs approved. It
Not
took
approved.
a long time to get the mortality claim. Okay, fine. but they essentially got approval on a surrogate because people thought probably, it's good to have a lower LDL.
I think that's the issue. It's like, how do we bottle that acceptance? Is that the significant scientific agreement that level? Is there some consensus among experts on which we could say, when we reach that point, and that consensus could be informed by all sorts of experiments, but not necessarily clinical endpoint experiments, can we say that we might be at stage 1 of being able to authorize a health span claim, with the idea, like an accelerated approval type concept, where we would validate the marker through subsequent levels of clinical investigation. And let me just go back to with accelerated approval. I mean, that allows for a high degree of uncertainty, but in a very, very narrow context. It's only for products for serious and life-threatening diseases, and only for products that show a substantial improvement over existing therapy. And so I think it's a policy decision, originally, by regulation, now in the statute, that Congress has given a permission structure. And the agency, basically designed its own permission structure, fueled by the AIDS crisis, to accept more uncertainty in return for helping people who are very, very sick and have not a lot of options, where there's preliminary evidence indicating that this could be a significant improvement. And we're sort of in a way, and this is a conversation Zan and I have had for years, that between the Orphan Drug Act and accelerated approval, we have a new kind of set of orphans, and that's the large chronic disease population, that they're not really getting the attention that these other groups are getting because of the more favorable regulatory programs. So I just become skeptical, don't mean to be combative here, but I become skeptical of the idea of being able to fit these things into an accelerated approval paradigm or a surrogate endpoint paradigm, knowing how narrowly that system is actually on paper drawn.
Well, if you believe that aging is a fatal disease, then you've got it, right? That's the crux of the matter.
Yes.
So if I show, and there are a lot of endpoints that could be used here that FDA loves. FDA loves functional endpoints, 6-minute walk, how curved is the spine, how strong are your muscles, all those kinds of things can be assessed, and they're clinical endpoints. But you have to be able to convince FDA, well, maybe not. You could maybe win on those endpoints and say, we think this is aging. This is not accelerated approval. It's approval, because we've shown, improvement in 3 or 4 aspects, of the aging process. So it's not specific to muscle function. It's not specific to, changes in the spine. It's not specific to CNS changes. So it's got to be aging. And so we want an approval. So that's a possibility.
So like a validated functional scale.
Yeah, and obviously there are a lot of them, and we all, none of us walk as fast as we did 10 years ago, right? That's a real thing, 6-minute walk. And it changes. It may take 5 years to change meaningfully in a control group, which means you're stuck with a 5-year study. But yeah, there are endpoints like that. When I dealt with this at work, I guess my thinking was, if you can show me improvement across a few domains, like I just said, that are not, that are seemingly unrelated to each other, but related to aging, then I'm going to accept this as aging, a change in aging, and I'm going to approve your drug. If you show me only improvement in muscle function, that's a problem, because maybe it's a muscle drug. Right? I can't give you an aging claim if all you do is show a change in 6-minute walk. But show me other things in other domains, and I'll be very happy to give you a claim for aging. That's how I felt about it.
Very, very interesting.
I don't think you need, I don't think you need new regulatory pathways. You need the regulatory pathways that we have to be used properly, and you need some people at FDA who are reasonably creative and understanding and can help. Everybody has a vested interest in this, which, unfortunately. But so I think that's what's needed. I'm maybe being a pinheaded bureaucrat here, not being willing to expand out to some new other regulatory pathways. But I think the ones that we have are pretty good. The one point that you raised is, well, you can't give accelerated approval if it's not a serious disease. But if it is aging, it's serious.
Well, that is the big philosophical, debate. Whether, again, for a nominally healthy individual, whether we would recognize that person is aging and trending towards fatality.
I mean, when
everyone's survival is always at stake.
Yeah.
So how do we, how do we get our minds around that, very philosophical paradigm?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I studied for the medicine boards, I remember learning that after age 40, you shrink a millimeter a year. There are things like that. A radiologist, one of my best friends, we were talking about memory, and he said, when you do a CT scan, a head CT on a 40-year-old, he said, there's a lot of space in there.
Mm.
It's not a magic that you lose intellectual capacity. He said your brain shrinks, and you can see it. I mean, I think there, and I'm no expert, obviously, but that's pretty striking if you think about it, that your brain is shrinking. And if you could show an effect on that, you could probably get people to agree it's a reasonable surrogate, if in fact aging is a fatal disease.
Let me ask you one more question, then we'll bring the group back in. It's a variation on what's in the chat, which is, okay, if we take this notion of aging as a disease, what's the entry point within, say, CDER? Which is that is there a division that would be the first stop, or do we need a little bit? Maybe we don't need a new regulatory system, but do we need to tweak the organizational structure to accommodate this type of thinking?
Well, I don't think you need to create a whole new division on aging. That's not going to happen. They don't have the even if it was the best idea in the world, they don't have the manpower to do that. It's going to go to a division, or maybe, with consulting from a couple other divisions. I would think, as the first four letters of this conference, or first five letters, METAB, sounds kind of like metabolic. And I suspect it would go to DDLO in
or
ocean.
general endocrinology.
Yeah, the general general endocrinology. Actually, that's actually what. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so that would go to Teresa Kehoe and Naomi Lowy.
And that's right. They're already looking at sarcopenia and consultant cachexia. So it's clear that age-related disability, if you have a treatment for that, that's pretty straightforward. You evaluate function or how people feel, and you get a claim or an approval based on evidence that the drug works at making somebody do better or feel better. So that's pretty straightforward. But Ellis, let me run by another example. It's a subtle difference, and this is right in your bailiwick, because you actually had these products in your office back at FDA. And this would be the example of the GLP agonists that were first approved for type 2 diabetes. And then they later added, I won't name brands, but they added a cardiovascular indication. And more recently, they've added an indication for improving renal outcomes. And now they have an indication, or they have a product for actually causing major weight loss for obesity. And now they are pursuing a trial for dementia. And so this is really kind of the hallmark of a drug that we would see as working at a root of the problem. And yet it will take going on 3.5 decades to get all of these indications if they would have been done one after another. On the other hand, there's a school of thought that you could do a kind of composite endpoint, which again, you're as familiar with as anybody on the planet, the major adverse coronary event or cardiovascular event composite. But instead, this would be a composite of the first appearance of one or another chronic disease. And the premise is that you would have statistical economy and being able to put this composite together. So your event rate would come sooner, in effect, on average, and that you would be able to see within maybe 3 to 5 years a change in the composite. Whereas if you were to take either one of the components, it would take longer to actually see that effect with the same number of patients. So that's another approach that has been posited for getting to evidence of a age-related claim sooner than otherwise would be the case.
Yeah, no, that's very well suited for aging, because when you're sitting across the table from a 40-year-old or a 65-year-old, you don't know what's going to happen to them first. So because you don't know whether they're going to develop renal dysfunction or a stroke or whatever, yeah, you construct an endpoint that measures all of those things. And if you can do it in a dichotomous way, so the outcome trials are you have an event or you don't, it's time to first event. But if you can rank outcomes, you can do a Finkelstein-Schoenfeld or something and gain a lot of power. So yeah, I mean, I would think for sure this would be a composite endpoint. But that's kind of what I was thinking when I say all across all these realms.
Yeah.
Because you don't know what's going to happen. But if somebody's brain shrinks or their 6-minute walk becomes horrible, that's an event. So yeah, I don't know. I still don't know about the 3 to 5 years, because again, you gotta have a long enough trial that things happen, right? To the to the control group.
Yeah, that's the challenge.
Yeah, if the event rate is low, over 3 to 5 years in an untreated population, over 10 years, yeah, you're getting to something. So that's one of the critical problems, I think. You can overcome that to some extent with huge numbers. So you're stuck with, what drives one of these studies is the number of events. So that's a
Sure.
function of how many patients and how long.
Sure.
Or we find the opposite of the blue zones. We find the red zone populations, right? And challenge.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
So I'd like to get Tom and Steve's reaction, whether you, and then I want to move over to Martin Hahn, back to the foods, where I think while we're spinning our wheels on the therapeutic side, the food industry is plowing ahead.
I would just say, Stephen, I'll turn it back to you, because I think actually this is probably what you'll say, but you mentioned it earlier. I think it depends on if you really want to be able to target these broader populations for people earlier who are not on the cusp of disease, but earlier in their trajectories. That's super hard under the model that Dr. Unger laid out, right? Those are the trials that you would have to involve so many people. It takes so long to see some evidence. So you end up like we do in the rest of drug development, focusing on late stage disease where it's easier to show impact. And I think if there are ways to actually use different types of evidence to show that impact rather than prospective kind of randomized clinical studies for 10 years, that's what we should be trying to shoot for with the agency and with Congress. But I'll let Stephen comment on that.
Yeah, a couple of comments. One about the biobanks. I mean, there are a number of these now with huge numbers and with historical samples. So how you divide that up, there's a bunch of independent ones. Those are analytical details that I think are very manageable. Yeah, and the way to enrich so that you get a lot of events in a hurry is to use older people, right? And particularly old people that are not in the greatest health. Doesn't tell you anything about the younger, healthy people, which is one of the key things about this. I think we're really going to have to use biomarkers and surrogate endpoints for that. But I think that's doable because we have samples for people who were healthy into their 90s, and we got their first samples when they were in their 40s. And there's hundreds and thousands of those things available now. So I think with the AI and a lot of work, a lot of computation, I think it's quite likely that there will be signatures of predictive signatures of health there that will allow us to develop these surrogate endpoints.
And to your point, Dave, I would just say, I think the accelerated approval pathway is a model. I don't think it's actually the right, the way it's structured today, I don't think it addresses the questions that we're raising, right? But I think the model of using surrogates or other intermediate markers to be predictive, right? And what type of evidence can let you kind of feel confident in the prediction, right? Those types of discussions, I think we have to have around health span, healthy longevity products, separate and apart from trying to, I think, shoehorn it into the current accelerated approval pathway, which I think has been designed for particular reasons and may not actually fit what we're trying to do. But the concept, right, is one that Congress has already adopted and the agency has adopted. And so building off of what people understand and people, accept, and explaining why that model should also work in other areas, I think that's the task.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said about the legislated framework and the regulatory culture that has grown up in that framework. And I think people understand at the agency that they have permission to make certain assumptions, some might say leaps of faith, to act in the face of uncertainty, but only in very narrow circumstances. Those are the circumstances that tend to be the highest profile, that get the most attention, but that's not really the routine work of the agency. And those circumstances are quite extreme. And I fear they don't speak to the almost 180 degrees away from that what we envision for health span products, which is intervening at the pre-disease stage. Larger populations who may never actually experience the disease. And
that goes to, right. And that's why it goes to the risk benefits where we started,
yes,
right? Which
yes,
is
yes.
the focus on products that have a long history of human consumption or ingestion, right? Products that, or molecules like amino acids, for example, where there is probably every expectation that you will not have, a safety issue with the products, but just trying to get the right composition to have the intended effect. Those are the types of things that you're going to have to do early on. And I think throughout the health span longevity, product market, right, is really trying to identify those places where you can say, we can give this to a healthy person. I will note that as the predictive abilities increase, I always think about the BRCA example, the BRCA gene, right? So people understand that you have that gene, women in particular, if you have that gene, they are willing to undertake some pretty serious medical procedures, pretty draconian, pretty radical, right? Because of the understood risk, right, of them getting to that point with disease relating to that gene. You can think about some of the same things with other chronic, that's not a chronic disease, but in terms of chronic disease, you can think about the same type of analysis. And if we can really demonstrate to people, right, that their risk, because of what's going on inside their own body, not some general risk because you're overweight or because you smoke or whatever, but because of what changes we're seeing in your body. And if we can demonstrate to them that means they have an 80%, 90% chance of developing within so many years X disease or X condition, I think people will be willing to accept those risks of getting some type of intervention. And I think that's what Congress, when you think about, accelerated approval has a very narrow focus today, But taking that model and saying these other types of risks that people face can be just as serious over the long term, both for them and for also for society, generally speaking. I mean, we haven't even talked about the burden of chronic disease, on society. But from a risk benefit perspective, allowing the agency to look at that and say, yes, they're seemingly healthy today, but the evidence suggests very strongly that they're not going to be. And that's how we have to try to do a different type of risk benefit calculation for healthy, longevity products.
Well, that's a really great plug for our national policy program this afternoon.
I mean,
But,
that's right.
And then there's the, as we've talked about before, the sort of the search engine mutation that Google can tell me just based on my searches over time, whether I'm trending towards type 2 diabetes or various ailments. Yeah.
Dave, I'm keen to hear from Martin because
Yeah, I was good.
this
We're
is
all segueing to Martin for the big finish
Yeah.
here.
Well, dietary supplements, that is, what was the technical term, Martin? It's a
Hot
mess.
Yeah, hot mess.
And the problem is there are probably some agents among that sea of thinly supported claims where there's really something there, but we just don't have the evidence that is sufficient to convince people like Steve and Ellis Unger in particular that you've got something. And so this seems to me to be an area of lack of incentives. There's no proprietary nature that would allow a company to benefit right now from doing a cardiovascular outcome trial for their nutritional product. So Martin, what's your wisdom there? What would you do if you were king and could change the way dietary supplements were? Or not, and this is not to say that we do away with dietary supplements. I'm saying, can there be an additional category where there is greater evidence to support the value?
Can we do better than dietary than what we have in dietary supplements as health span products, right?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunities for improvement. And what I'm seeing is a lot of innovation that's taking place because people are able to do what Thomas's company is doing in terms of using artificial intelligence, looking at dietary ingredients or conventional foods and mining the data. And we're actually finding some really interesting interventions that actually could help reduce the risk of various types of chronic disease. I'm very encouraged to hear about the work that's taking place with biomarkers because, quite frankly, now one of the biggest impediments is if we want to talk about reducing the risk of certain chronic diseases, in order to get that approved health claim by FDA, you have to have, without a biomarker, you have to have a control and a study population, getting the nutritional intervention, monitoring them for 5 or 10 or 15 years. And then, yes, you go to the agency and you say, yes, this particular intervention will reduce your risk of developing osteoarthritis. You spent millions of dollars and you have no proprietary value in that claim. And so there really is no incentive from the food industry perspective to do that research because you've just spent $20 million and everybody who happens to have that crystalline glucosamine sulfate or whatever the ingredient may be can benefit from the same claim as well. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we have. I mean, we all recognize, and I studied nutrition back in the 1980s in college, and we've always known that there's an element between nutrition and health. And now we have the tools available to actually see what type of substances that are found in foods and in dietary ingredients can actually be efficacious and may actually have some real impact. But what my clients run into and the frustration they get is they can invest in the time and the resources, but they have no protection. And that is, I think, one of the downsides from the food industry perspective. Your incentive is to be first to market, try to build the market. And yes, that's great, but you're immediately facing some type of cannibalization of your market share by somebody can come in with a similar formulation, cut the price, and then you're competing in the marketplace.
Well, great point. And so could you foresee the general will building to the point that there could be some kind of legislation that would change the way incentives are provided. And this might also extend over to drugs. For example, we know we have the 505(b)(2) pathway that gives 5 years of exclusivity to a new chemical entity. But for a longer haul indication, it would seem like it should be a longer exclusivity.
I think there's an opportunity, and we also have in the food world, we can only talk about reducing the risk if we get FDA authorization of a health claim or of a qualified health claim. I can't talk about any disease states without being regulated as a drug. And so the limitations that I have in terms of a company who they can invest in the research, and I help companies every day invest in the research, but they may be able to show that this particular dietary intervention has been demonstrated to reduce your risk of developing type 2 diabetes, but we can't say that. And so all I can say is spend $20 million on a clinical study proving the efficacy of your product, and you can say can support healthy blood cholesterol, blood sugar levels in people within the normal range. And you're not going to be able to communicate without going to FDA, which is fine. I mean, that's the system we have today. But it does present challenges in terms of those nutritional products that are being studied, evaluated, shown to be efficacious. We then have restrictions on the type of claims that we make, and we have structure function claims that you can say that don't really communicate very well to the consumer.
Yeah. Terrifically helpful.
And unhelpful at the same time, right?
Yeah. Well,
Right. It's an open source system, and similar.
Yeah.
We have by legislation now a system for qualifying new biomarkers, but by law that system is transparent and open to the public. And so if you spend X millions of dollars qualifying a new biomarker with, say, a very sophisticated artificial intelligence program, that marker, if you want it to be qualified by the agency and through their program, becomes a public biomarker for others to use, which is another, I mean, that's again oversimplification, and there are maybe other ways to get around that by not going through that system and doing it on an application specific basis. But generally, when we talk about biomarkers today, as a result of the more recent legislation, it's a public program. Thomas, sir, I don't know if you're curating the comments.
Yeah, I'm just checking myself. We've got plenty of interesting comments and questions.
Yes, I'd like to give a chance.
Adrian Berg raised the question about using the citizens petition as an instrument. Anybody want to field that right quick?
Is it?
Well, she asked two questions.
No,
I think.
Go ahead. Citizen scientists? Something.
Well,
Okay.
I thought she later asked about a citizens petition. Maybe but
Let me just say, from a skeptical scientist standpoint, that self-reported information doesn't cut it with the scientists that I know for the most part. So that would be my only concern.
Yeah. And another issue is once we have validated biomarkers, they're validated as biomarkers, but we really need evidence that it's not just an association, that an intervention doesn't have some kind of impact on. So do we still need to do clinical trials once we've actually validated the surrogate to confirm that there is a real benefit that occurs when you intervene against that surrogate?
Right, but it only needs to last 5 years instead of 20 years. Then.
Yeah.
Well, this is Thomas, just for the benefit of folks who haven't seen sort of a draft legislation making the rounds, Dave Fox had proposed a system of tiers of evidence that go toward different kinds of health span products, and granting of different levels of early access and temporary market exclusivity. So those are all tools that can be used to help provide the right incentives.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, for that plug. So sort of going back to Steve Austad and the notion that in the early going, we are going to probably lean heavily on well-known compounds with long history of use in a broad population, and that brings us into the area of really repurposing our existing products, and there's a very, very obvious tension between repurposing old compounds that have no more patent life on the composition, where there may be so much written about them prior art that getting any kind of meaningful IP protection will be really difficult. And because these compounds are largely genericized and available as a commodity, while it seems on the surface that the market potential is great, it's diluted. The value is so diluted by so many people having access to the compound and being able to ride the coattails of the pioneer. So one of the things we've been looking at is how do we create some kind of incentive structure to give value to people who do innovative research to repurpose these products when the IP system may not be the answer for them. And so we've been looking at and testing out an idea of some kind of private enforcement of claims rather than depending upon FDA to step in and take action against somebody who's misbranding their product by making a claim for which they don't have the authorization. But we would obviously welcome other suggestions and input. And the intent of this was not to answer all the questions, but actually to just open people's minds, show them some of the problems that we're trying to solve. And by all means, all ideas, suggestions are welcome. There are so many decision points that need to be made in designing any kind of system. And so I think this was terrific as a starter. So I think it's the first time we've run this particular panel. And so Zan and Thomas, thank you for setting this up and giving us the airtime to do this.
Well, we can't thank you enough, and the panelists. What a great group of people and wonderful discussion. I wish we had an entire day to spend with all of you.